Hello. I'm a Neltharion, Hunter Guide Writer and Theory Crafter for many years. This is my Marksmanship Hunter Trinket tier list for Dragonflight Season 4. By the time you see this video, my Hunter Guides and Icy Veins for Season 4 will probably be updated, and you can find them in the doobly-doo below. You might want to cross-check this video with my written guide, since they can be updated and this video obviously cannot, but at least for the launch of Season 4, this will be correct. Alright, let's hop straight in. Starting out with Pip's Emerald Friendship Badge, which is a stat stick trinket that also provides some stats. Marksmanship Hunters are very bursty, and so we don't really like these flat trinkets too much unless they're super well tuned, so it goes in the try to replace tier. Next up is the Alacritous Alchemist Stone, which you can get from Alchemy. It's also kind of a stat stick trinket with some random procs on it, if I recall correctly, but it goes in the just don't tier, just because I don't see any reason why you would ever want to craft this. Next up is the Bottle of Spiraling Winds. So this is just a passive stat proc. This one, it's not really all that good. It's going into just try to replace tier, but like if we're only looking at Mythic Plus trinkets, aside from some we'll see later on, it's like a good backup to those. But yeah, generally speaking, if you're limiting yourself to Mythic Plus trinkets in Season 4, you're holding yourself quite a bit back. On the contrary, the Neltharion's Call to Dominance class trinket from Aberrus is best tier. This is the best trinket for Marksmanship Hunters by some margin, and you'll see some of the interactions we can make with it later. Essentially, when you pop, between your true shots, you will basically build up stacks of this trinket, and when you pop true shot, they will get activated for an agility buff. And this is not an unused trinket, but it kind of works like an unused trinket in that it will always activate with your cooldown. That's how it works. Next up is the Whispering Incarnate icon. So this is a good trinket. It's very highly tuned despite being a passive trinket. And of course, exactly how good it is depends on how many allies you have with it and what roles they are. But overall, it's a good trinket. Next up is Spiteful Storm from Raszageth, which is this strange trinket that gets more powerful the longer the fight goes on. Awakened raid fights are not really that long, typically, and it has no single AoE scaling of any kind, and it goes in the just don't tier. Next up is the Erupting Spear Fragment, which is a sort of, it does both a bit of damage, but primarily increases your stats and can be used with your cooldowns. It's going in the try to replace tier because it's a little bit undertuned. Next up is the Idol of Pure Decay, which is a sort of single target proc trinket that will just do raw damage. Given that we want stat trinkets for the most part, and this is a single target only, it's going in the just don't tier, because I see no reason why you would ever really equip it unless you had absolutely nothing available to you. Next up is the Irideus Fragment. Irideus Fragment it's sort of like Bis minus. It is a 3-minute unused trinket that pairs exceptionally well with Neltharion's Call to Dominance. The logic being here is that you cannot normally use two unused trinkets at the same time, because using one will put the other one on a 20-second cooldown. But the Neltharion's Call to Dominance is not technically an unused trinket, but it will proc on your cooldowns for a ton of agility. And that pairs exceptionally well on your cooldowns with like genuine unused trinkets, such as the Irideus Fragment, which is one of the burstiest trinkets in the entire game. So these two trinkets pair very well. Like if you... For example, like the Irideus Fragment, it will not be best here if you do not pair it with the Call to Dominance, and you'll see that later on with another trinket as well. So just keep that in mind. Like these trinkets, like a lot depends on the Neltharion's Call to Dominance to be good, because Neltharion's Call to Dominance buffs other unused trinkets by a massive margin. So that's how you should think about it. Alright, next up is the Storm Eater's Boon. This is going in a just don'ts tier because it stops you moving when you use it. Its damage has recently been nerfed by 25%. It's not tuned well enough, and it's just insanely inconvenient to use, and you have to be in melee as well. Next up is the Dragonfire Bomb Dispenser. This one was pretty recently nerfed on the PTR, and it used to be like a pure single target trinket, but since it's nerfed, it's now in the try to replace tier, both because it's a bit undertuned, but also because it's only single target, and we really want trinkets that can do both things, both single target and AoE. Next up is the Darkmoon deck Dance from Inscription, I believe. And this one is going in the just don't tier, once again, because I just can't see any reason why you would ever actually spend the spark to craft this. Next up is Fyrakk, Fyrakk's the Tainted Rageheart, which is going in the situational tier. This is not a DPS trinket, but rather it is a defensive trinket, and it can be very, very good for surviving one-shots in Mythic Plus. So obviously for Mythic Plus, you would never pick it for pure DPS, you would never pick it. But for Mythic Plus, if you need to survive, and survivability is ultimately the thing that limits most keys and not your damage, although damage matters as well, then you might go with the Rageheart. But it is one of those things where, like, if you have to ask if you have to use it, you probably don't have to use it. Next up is Idol of the X, where X is basically any of 4 different names. This is what is it? I think an alchemy trinket. I don't think it's alchemy actually. It's a Jewelcrafting trinket. And it basically procs a stat depending on the gems you have available. It is not very highly tuned, however, but it can still go in the try to replace tier. Once again, like, at least this one gives stats, unlike many of the other ones. It's still very hard to imagine why you would ever want to do it, but, you know, maybe. At least it's not as bad of a trinket inherently as like the Alchemist Stone and the Darkmoon deck. Alright, next up is Bandolier. So this one is a pure single target proc trinket that has to be used from close to melee range. So given like how MM works and everything, and its tuning and it being single target, it's going in a just don't tier, just because I don't think you'll ever use it. Next up is Beacon to the Beyond. Beacon to the Beyond is not very highly tuned for raw damage, but it is exceptional for ultra short-term burst on a 3-minute cooldown. It can be used in Mythic Plus scenarios and stuff to like nuke down ads that absolutely need to die very quickly. You can rotate it between party members. This can make it good even if it is like not good for your actual DPS. So it's going into situational tier. Next up is the Ruby Whelp Shell, and I recommend, if you do have this trinket, which I don't necessarily recommend, but if you do have it, you should train it for Sleeping Ruby Warmth. And if that means nothing to you, then look up this trinket on Wowhead, because it's a very interesting trinket, and you have to train it to work properly and all that stuff. You cannot just like get this trinket and equip it. You have to train it over like, don't recall if it's like 6 days in order to reach peak efficiency with it. But even when you do train it appropriately and everything, it is in the try to replace tier. Next up is Witherbark's Branch, which is from Season 3. This trinket is a very, very powerful 2-minute unused trinket that pairs exceptionally well with Neltharion's Call to Dominance. If you have this at 489 eye level, and you play it perfectly, where you like space out the orb pickups that you do of this, then it is best tier. If you don't do that, it's more like a good tier. This is like, and you obviously, if you're watching this in Season 4 and you don't have this trinket, you're not getting this trinket, because you can only have it if you had it from Season 3 going into Season 4. Next up is the Mirror of Fractured Tomorrows. You might think this is a Season 3 trinket, but actually you can get it in hard mode Dawn of the Infinite at 521 item level in Season 4. It is a pretty damn good trinket. It pairs well with a Call to Dominance on your true shot, but some of its value is tied up in this ad that spawns and does raw damage and doesn't scale that well with other effects, and for that reason it's going into good tier. Next up is the Coiled Serpent Idol. This is a reasonably tuned single target proc trinket that is going into try to replace tier, because I just don't see any reason you would, we want trinkets to do everything for us, and this one just doesn't. It's only single target. Next up is the Algathar Puzzle Box from Algathar Academy. This one is basically slightly, like very, very slightly better than Irideus Fragment, but it does have a cast time. So this is our next best trinket, like basically the one you really want, alongside Call to Dominance. Irideus Fragment is tuned slightly worse, but it does not have a cast time, while Puzzle Box has a cast time that a lot of players find annoying. So if you just really hate the cast time of Puzzle Box, you can go with Irideus Fragment, it's totally viable. But the absolute peak DPS setups for Marksmanship are all basically Neltharion's Call to Dominance and Algathar Puzzle Box. Alright, next up is the Igneous Flowstone. This is a pure single target proc trinket with a little bit of stats on it as well. It is not tuned very well, so it's going into try to replace tier. Next up is the Ominous Chromatic Essence. This is a decent pairing for Neltharion's Call to Dominance if you don't want to mess around with unused trinkets, which I do really think you should be using. But it is pretty decent as an alternative, especially if allies using it. And as for what stat you want this to give you, because you can change what stat it gives, it's usually gonna be, crit or mastery, maybe verse or something. You just have to sim it. It's very easy to on raid bots, but it's going in the good tier. Next up is the Screaming Black Dragon Scale. So this is basically a stat stack trinket, and it's going in the try to replace tier for its low tuning. Next up is the Manic Grief Torch. This is an interesting trinket. So if you have no Destiny group, which is unlikely, let's be real, it is going in the like sort of high end of good tier. But if you have just a few devs, it can very quickly become competitive with Puzzle Box and Irideus Fragment, even when paired with a Neltharion's Call of Dominance, and it can go in the Biz tier. But just keep in mind that this is sort of Biz tier with a few caveats. If you have a ton of devs, this one easily becomes the best trinket in the game by a mile. But it's pretty unlikely you'll have that many devs, and of course, the devs have to be spaced out a little bit to allow you to actually use the trinket. So interesting trinket. You'll probably see a lot of rank 1 passes with Manic Grief Torch, because obviously the potential of this trinket is much, like the peak potential, if everything goes right and everyone dies in a perfect spacing and at the right time and everything. This trinket has the highest peak potential of any trinket, but this is sort of based on its realistic placement in most groups. Next up is the Ashes of the Ember Soul. Very, very powerful burst trinket, but its overall tuning is not that good. It is decent when paired to Neltharion's Call to Dominance, especially if like you're building everything up towards like a single very important burst of the fight. This one can probably be best tier, but overall for its tuning, it is going in the good tier. Next up is the Globe of Jagged Ice, which comes from Halls of Infusion. This is a pretty interesting trinket that does quite a bit of AoE damage, and is also decent on single target. It's going in the try to replace tier, because I think there are other trinkets that do this quite a bit better though. Next up is the Controlled Current Technique trinket. If you've seen my BM Hunter tier list, which I'll also put in the description below, you might think this trinket is great. But the reason it's good for BM is that it improves pet attack speed. MM Hunters pretty much never use pets, and so it's going in a just don't tier for MM, because like auto attack damage is just not really that valuable for us. And finally, we have Augury of the Primal Flame from Mythic Fyrakk. This is going in a try to replace tier. We don't really run insane amounts of crit to justify this trinkets on a really high level. It's tuning, even though it's higher eye level than almost all the other trinkets, just not justify a higher tier list position than this. So yeah, I hope you found this useful. Please leave any feedback in the comments below. And yeah, I'll see you in Season 4. Bye-bye.